So hi everyone. Today in this video, I have a conversation with Varun, who's a fellow colleague of mine in physics, who also grew up in a Hindu background. So I decided to actually split this podcast up into two different parts. One where we talk about Hinduism and its potential similarities and differences with Christianity, and then a second part is more of a you know he doesn't fully believe that you can unify actual science and religion, and so we had a pretty in-depth conversation about that, and we started talking about interpretations of quantum mechanics, and it got somewhat technical. So I want to kind of separate these into two separate videos because the ideas seem quite distinct. But yeah, check it out. So make sure to check out part two if the scientific discussion sounds interesting to you, and I hope you enjoy. Hello, YouTube. Welcome to the Unity Podcast, episode 2. I'm here today with Varun. He's a colleague of mine in physics at UT Berkeley. And yeah, so he started watching my videos and mentioned to me that, he's kind of had similar-ish views, and that, except he comes from a background actually of Hinduism. And, Hinduism is one of these religions that's, it's quite popular, but it's one that I know virtually nothing about. So I thought it'd be really interesting to kind of, at least from my perspective, to hear more about Hinduism and kind of get an idea of, what the religion is kind of all about and what kind of the basic premise is. And then, maybe how that also relates to something like Christianity, which I'm more familiar with. And then also, so I'm coming from this attitude that I think, science and religion are easily, reconcilable. And Varun's a bit more skeptical about that. So that's, something else that we're hoping to get into a little later on. So, yeah, why don't you take it away, Varun?
Sure, yeah. Thanks so much, Nick, and thanks for having me on the podcast.
Of course.
I do really like the idea behind your channel. So when you told me about it, I was very excited to start watching.
Great.
Especially with like someone with your background. I think it brings a different perspective to trying to understand science and religion together. So I'm excited to be here.
Great.
I guess a bit about myself for the episode is um, I I'm Indian and I'm Hindu is like I guess the religion I follow and the one that I grew up with. I actually grew up in the Middle East in a like Muslim majority country. So that has like brought some, I guess, interesting perspectives to my beliefs as well. But for the most part, I'm like a Hindu South Indian. So a bit about like a quick overview of what Hinduism is, or at least where it's practiced and who practices it. Hinduism it originated in the Indian subcontinent. It's a very old religion. I don't know exactly how old. Presumably, it's like one of the oldest ones around. It's practiced in India, Nepal, uh, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and parts of Southeast Asia like Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Um, so it's honestly it's a little hard to describe what Hinduism is to someone who hasn't grown up with it.
Sure, sure.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. I can give you a brief overview of things that I do know about Hinduism,
sure,
which is
yeah.
not much, but like, I know, for example, that it's considered like a caste system, I believe, right? And so I'm not exactly sure what that means. And then, like, things that I'm curious about is, are there gods? Is there a god? Is it a polytheistic religion? And then maybe also like rituals. Like, do you go to something like church on Sundays, or kind of like more things like this would be really interesting for me to hear about with Hinduism.
Sure, yeah. I guess we'll get to the caste thing later. As far as I know, the caste system is not really it's not an element of Hinduism per se. I think it's more so like a Indian subcontinent tradition. I don't know if that's like it's not, as far as I understand, it's not a religious element.
See,
Um,
see,
it's
okay.
more like just this sociological structure that evolved in the area. I don't think it's tied to the idea of God or divinity in any way.
I see.
Um,
Okay.
but yeah, as for is there a God, this is also a very difficult thing to
Sure,
put in concretely.
sure.
Like I think if you looked up just Wikipedia or asked the average person who knew a little bit about Hinduism, they would say it's a polytheistic religion.
Okay.
There are like, at least on paper, there are like 330 million different deities worshipped by different people in India.
330 million? Is that what you
In the
said?
sense that yeah, like literally every village or subsect of people has their own deity, which is some version of the more popular ones. So the
I
more
see.
popular
Interesting.
ones you may or may not have heard of are like Shiva,
Okay, I've
Vishnu.
heard of this. Yeah. Okay. Yep. Yep. Right.
So like Shiva and Vishnu are probably the biggest ones.
Hmm.
Um, I think one thing that may be of interest to you and like people watching this channel that is a little different about Hinduism and Eastern religions in general is that there is no like unifying theology as such. There are like scattered scriptures here and there written by scholars and things like that. There's actually very few links to the claim of divinity itself, the sense that a lot of these books are written as legends or stories.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in very few places, uh, to the best of my knowledge, is there like a direct link to the notion of a god.
Mm.
So this leads to several different popular interpretations of Hinduism. So I think the most popular by far is what's called the Bhakti movement of Hinduism,
Okay.
and that is more along the lines of like conventional religion in the sense that you pray to a god or many different gods typically in Hinduism. You pray to them, you like offer your respect or your worship, and it's like based on faith and things like that. And
And
that's
then,
by far the most. Sorry, go on.
yeah, is this considered like a ritualistic thing that you do? Like I know in Islam, for example, they pray 5 times a day. Like, is there something like this in Hinduism, or is it more like, you know, you pray when you feel it's necessary to pray, or like, do you have more of a ritualistic, like routine to it? And then also, I guess, when you pray to a particular god, yeah, I guess I'm kind of curious, like, what is the desire or the goal behind the act of prayer?
Yeah. So this depends on what type of Hinduism you follow, I guess. So for the most part, there's no ritual or routine element to it. Like we don't have prayers on Sundays or prayers 5 times a day. We have like temples. Temples will have like different idols, and they'll have like priests who will recite some chants and things like that from the Gita, the Upanishads. These are all like Hindu scriptures, basically. And then yeah, it's more. I think the act of prayer, Hinduism revolves around the socialization in the temple, and I think this is like uh, a common trend in different religions. Like a lot of people go to church not because they're particularly religious, but because like to church you meet other people.
Sure,
It's like a
sure.
social thing. I think it's very similar, like going to temples in India, and yeah, but I don't. There is no like there's no set schedule. You don't even have to pray as such. Like this is what I'm kind of trying to get at is that um, Eastern religions in general. This isn't unique to Hinduism. There is um, there's like a distinct absence of doctrine. I want to say, and like to the extent that there is, it's like the follower chooses what type of doctrine they want to follow. Um, so
Yeah, okay. Like, I mean, the only Eastern religion that I have at least some familiarity with, and it's not much, is Buddhism. And, like I was really into meditation and then certain ideas from Buddhism, and I used to watch a Buddhist or a former Buddhist monk on YouTube. And he became a psychiatrist, and so he actually incorporates a lot of Buddhist ideas into it, and then so that seems aligned with this, and then yeah, so like it seemed from that. Okay, I'm not even going to speak to rituals because I really don't know, but like it was more of a mindset. It's more of a like accepting, for example, that life is fundamentally suffering, and what causes suffering is your attachments to things, and then to be a true pinnacle of enlightenment, and to be an enlightened Buddhist monk is to relinquish all attachments in some sense, and so is it more like this? Like, is there a pathway to something like a monk in the case of Hinduism also, or is it more just like a kind of a lifestyle and a community And then, yeah, and then I'm also kind of curious what the relationship to a god or gods is, and what
Yeah.
that is like. Yeah.
Uh, Um, so that it's interesting. If you know a little about Buddhism, you definitely know a lot about Hinduism.
Okay.
Buddhism and Hinduism are like very intertwined. They're actually essentially the same in many ways, and then they diverge in
Sure.
some
Sure.
aspects of their philosophy. Um, Buddhism tends to be a little more deistic in its practice, in the sense that there's no like deity besides the Buddha, who was just like a prince
Sure.
who then
Sure.
became a monk and things like that. In Hinduism, well, here's the thing. I do believe, and a lot of people believe, that the idea behind the rituals, and the rituals in like Hindu temples, they're like quaint and cute. Like there'll be like flowers and some like colored powders and things like that, and then you like offer it to the idol, and then you pray,
Hmm.
and like the priest will give you like a sweet. It's like things like that are what the rituals are.
Okay.
And on special occasions at home, you might do like what's called a puja, which is like a little prayer at home, and like a offering of like flowers and food, things like that. So the rituals tend to revolve around this, and then you would typically have a priest who's familiar with um, the chants in Hinduism, and like recite those, which are like um, praises of the idols that you're worshiping. Um, Now, with regard to the question of like the relationship with gods, right? This is where it gets a little complicated, because I said that we have like 330 million like
Yeah. Tell me a bit about each one
deities.
of them, please.
So, as far as like the theology goes, I think you could kind of reduce it to. I actually view Hinduism, like when we look at it in the framework of there being a god, as being dualistic.
What do you
Dualism
mean by
is the
that?
wrong word. That means dualism means something else. I mean that there's like two forms of deity, and that in Hinduism it's like you have the male power and the female power. You can kind of
Okay.
like reduce it down to this, and I say power because it's presented as a very abstract thing. It's like not called a god per se. Now, these like male and female powers manifest as deities. As so, the three big ones on like the the male side are like Vishnu, Shiva, and Brahma.
Hmm.
They represent what's called the Trimurti, which is like the tribe, like three, the power of three, really.
Okay.
And so the way the theology goes is that Brahma is the creator, like he created the universe. Um, Vishnu is the protector, so he's the one who most people would pray to
Mm.
for like day-to-day things, like for protection for this and that. He's the one who keeps the universe safe as such. And then Shiva is the destroyer. So there's an
Really?
element.
Okay.
Yeah.
See.
This is probably another interesting thing that
Hmm.
is not very common in Western religions, is that there's a element of like reincarnation and cyclic behavior. So Shiva is like tasked with destroying the universe every few eons or so, because the
Really?
yeah, the notion is that humanity becomes so depraved and despicable that they cause their own destruction, or they come to the point where
Mm.
um, Shiva has to come and like just like destroy the universe, and then like Brahma creates it again.
I see. That's actually really interesting. Uh, huh. Yeah. So then, yeah, like I kind of wonder where that comes from. Like, because from our point of view, it kind of seems like that might be the case, right? Because it's kind of like like the written history stops at something like 2 or 3 thousand BC or something. It's like
Yep.
it's not very long in the past. Yeah, but it's like, okay, well, obviously something had to come before then, but we have no record of it. So then, in some sense, it's like we've like put ourselves in a particular eon that is defined by maybe Christ or something. I'm not really sure what exactly defines it, but we're in a particular eon, and like I could imagine the case that prior to this, there was a civilization. I guess like History Channel and kind of more conspiracy theory people love talking about like the city of Atlantis and stuff, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, no, sure, sure. And
We
then
have like very similar myths of like drowned cities and things like that.
I see, yeah,
That
and
yeah.
okay, and then you have the creator and the protector, and yeah, it's interesting because in Christianity, these two are kind of unified. And if you saw my video on gods, this is one idea that I kind of struggle with. Well, I guess there's another aspect. There's the protector. I'm trying to think if that aligns with the Christian notion of God. Like obviously, like the Christian notion of God is that he is the creator, but he's more than that. And one thing that I've been thinking of with this new kind of Christian movement is like I believe kind of in a polytheistic universe, but then there's like there's essentially an infinite number of gods, but then there's kind of one divine God. But then, like in the kind of tradition, Abrahamic religions, there's one God, and then this God is like the creator. He's also, like kind of the symbol of that which is good and that which is true, and also the symbol of love. And so, like somehow all these things are the same thing. And then he also will guide you if you, have faith in him. And, so there's kind of, but like it sounds like potentially in Hinduism, maybe it's like these aspects are actually separated into unique gods. Like you have a creator, you have a protector. We don't exactly have a destroy. I mean, like if you want to include Satan, Satan kind of is like that in the, like kind of, let's say Abrahamic canon, but it's, but yeah, so I mean, maybe that's kind of aligned with Shiva in this case.
Yeah, well, actually, I do think Hinduism is uh, more along the lines of your theistic worldview, in the sense that I don't think it's correct to think of them as like entirely separate entities. In the sense that there's this notion of like what they call the Paramatma, which means it's like this, it's like the supreme soul if you literally translate it. And this is why I think Hinduism, like at its core, is probably more deistic than polytheistic.
Okay, what
Because
does this
like
word mean? Deistic? Like deistic is like
de-
with Buddhism in the case that you don't have like a true deity. Is that what that word
yeah,
means? Okay.
yeah, it means that you believe in some form, not necessarily like an anthropomorphic deity. It means you believe that it's like a non-interventionist God. Like he doesn't deal in the day-to-day affairs of like, humankind. Doesn't necessarily take an active hand in what goes on in the universe. That's not what Hinduism believes, but like deism just
Okay.
means that
Okay.
there's like there's something there. Um,
Okay.
it,
Okay.
yeah,
See.
so I do think like this idea of creator, protector, destroyer is just manifestations of this like belief in some higher power.
I see. Yeah. And so, uh, you know, I used to be like pretty militant atheist and then agnostic, and then now I, consider myself overtly religious. And one of the things that kind of got me from, let's say, agnostic into overtly religious was coming up with. And I didn't come up with it. I was inspired by people like Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Peugeot and a few others. Uh, but to conceptualize, at least in the Abrahamic religions, this divine logos as kind of like trying to articulate the values that are like the greatest good, right? And so then it's, it seems like this was kind of in the psyche, and there's a fantasy in the, psyche, and uh, like in this region, to kind of try to get at what is the greatest good. And then if you look at the stories, it's like you can see that they're iteratively getting better and better and progressing towards, kind of like Jesus is kind of like the, climax of the story of trying to get better and better and trying to come up with essentially what is the greatest good. And you see like early on you have kind of like even God himself seems like kind of dubious, and then it gets
Yeah.
better and better, and then you have Moses, which is like seems much better, and then has like a better relationship with God, and then it kind of they're all kind of pointing to like, okay, the Son of God's coming, and like essentially we're like the desire is to try to articulate what is the perfect mode of being in some sense. What is the perfect way for us to act, to be in alignment, to bring, you know, to minimize suffering or something like that. And so like that's kind of, it seems to be like in the, the collective psyche that gives rise to this religion. And
Sure.
so do you feel like there's something like that in Hinduism also, where it's like, so you have the creator, the destroyer, and the protector. So the protector is one maybe I don't fully understand, but then is there like kind of a guideline and set of principles on kind of how you should act, or something like that, or what defines like a perfect mode of being?
So I think the answer to that is, like, if you ask me, is there a set, like, is there a definitive prescription for how you should live, since maybe like the Bible gives you or the Quran gives you?
Mhm.
The answer is no.
Okay.
Um, uh, it's in some sense Hinduism is not even like one religion. It's just like this set of beliefs that kind of like got lumped together because these people coexisted together in the same geographical area. There's like many different ways people interpret Hinduism and like take what they will from that. I don't think uh, there are some central aspects to it, like in line with trying to find the greatest good. I think is this notion of like moksha, which you might have heard of in Buddhism. It's Moksha just translates very roughly to salvation, and it's
Okay.
like
That's like the mission of
it's just
Jesus, actually. Yeah, yeah. So
yeah.
interesting.
Um,
Yeah. Okay.
in, like Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism and like Eastern religions, I think it's the notion of ridding oneself of material dependencies and just generally like attaining a higher state of being and one which is
Sure.
tied down to the earth. So that is very similar, I think, to
What
you
does that
describe
mean?
as.
Not to be tied down to the earth.
Well, it means so there's like this there's a line from the Gita that I think uh, encapsulates this quite well. In fact, translated, it means um, true victory lies in conquering one's baser instincts.
Mm.
To me that means that like means like ridding yourself of the dependencies that come with feeling things like jealousy, greed. Very
Okay.
similar
Sure.
to what a lot of the Bible says.
No. Sure.
Um,
Sure. Right.
it just
Yeah.
says it, I think, in much less direct in a much less direct fashion. I think the general theme of Hinduism is that there's some goal that we call moksha or salvation, whatever it is. And there's like many different ways to get there. You
And,
find which one is best for you.
and then you said there's not like a canonical text, but there's kind of like a collection of writings by scholars. Like in the, I guess the closest thing to the canon that you have, or like let's say in the stories that loosely are bound together under Hinduism, is there a notion of someone who's achieved this state? Is it moksha? Is that how you say that?
Moksha, yeah, Moksha.
Okay, yeah. Is there any example of someone kind of achieving this state? And then would you say that like Buddha achieved this state, or
That's I would say so. Like I think there are a lot of examples in these stories or like these collections of texts uh, of like sages that who have achieved these states, and they're always portrayed as having like greater power. They're capable of like granting boons or curses, things like that. But
capable of
yeah, there are
what?
plenty of
Say that again.
like they're capable of like giving boons, uh,
What's
like
that?
granting you a wish.
I see. Okay,
Yeah, or like cursing you if you offend them. They're quite funny
sure.
in the stories actually.
I see. Interesting. Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
So like there's a reward for achieving this because like kind of at least in the biblical canon, right? It's something like to be if you are a follower of Jesus, then you'll experience eternal life, right? So that's kind of the idea is that the reward is if you align yourself in idea with Jesus. Now, like this is actually debated. I mean, there's definitely certain uh you know denominations of Christianity that say oh well Jesus died for our sins, and so we're all saved, and that's the end of it. And then there's other like more orthodox views that are kind of like, no, the goal is to essentially, Jesus is the personification of the perfect mode of being, and we ought to try to act in alignment with that. And then, it's something like achieving that state is to achieve theosis, which is kind of the ultimate goal of, going to be reunited with God, and then something like the reward is eternal life. So
I see.
interesting,
Okay.
yeah. So kind of, at least in principle, like kind of the gist of that sounds somewhat similar. If you, by achieving this
Yeah.
state of moksha, you get some kind of reward and some kind of ability to, perform miracles in some sense.
Yeah. So one thing about Hinduism is that the further back you go, the more abstract these stories become. The oldest Hindu texts to our knowledge are called the Vedas. They're just hymns, really.
Hmm.
It doesn't mention anything about God per se. Just hymns about like people living together and some deities, I guess you could say. Uh, they aren't even stories per se. And then like as you go further on through history, you get like the Upanishads, and then you get like more detailed uh, stories about like particular gods and like their battles with evil and things like that.
I see. Okay.
So, so it depends on how you want to look at it. Like this idea of moksha seems somewhat central to all of these texts.
Sure.
I guess like the later in history you go, the more it becomes like, oh yes, this sage achieved moksha by meditating on top of a mountain, and then like Vishnu came down and granted him like some power for meditation. There are a lot of these stories later on.
And Vishnu is which one? Is he the god of the
The
the protector?
protector, yeah.
Protector. I see. Okay.
That's
Interesting.
a complicated one because like even like all these gods have different forms, and they come in like various stages of history. In like each of these eons, as I mentioned,
Hmm.
Vishnu plays some role in like trying to intervene in humanity. Then yeah, and like eventually it decides that these people are beyond redemption, and then Shiva
Hmm.
comes in and like wipes everyone.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I recently started reading the Old Testament. So I like have never read the Bible. Like I mean, I grew up in going to church till I was like 10, and I went to Sunday school, and I half paid attention, so I have some vague idea of these stories plus conversations. And I started reading the Old Testament, and this like reminds me of like God was a questionable character actually in the Old Testament. Like there's one time where like with Noah's Ark, it's this famous story of this flood, and then Noah builds this ark. I mean, God literally said, like, basically, like, I'm disgusted with humans,
Yeah,
and like, hey, Noah, I'm going to choose you to, save, two of every animal, and you can bring your family, but the rest of you, I'm just wiping out. Like, I'm sick of you guys, and like, I'm
yeah,
just going to exterminate them. So it kind of reminds me of that in some sense. And there's like a couple actual stories kind of like this, and then, instead of being all of humanity with Noah's Ark, then there's like a particular regions or cities or something. Like there's the story of called Sodom and Gomorrah, of a city that essentially God decides to burn down, and he's just like,
yeah,
yeah, I don't like these people. And then even the person that he's talking to, Abraham, is kind of like, I believe it's Abraham, is kind of like, like, please, if there's like at least a couple of good people, can you like not burn them down? He was like, all right, fine, like if there's 50 good people, I won't blow the whole place up. And then he like kind of talks him down to 10 or something, and then he ends up blowing the whole thing up. It's just like, okay, Jesus. It's like hard to reconcile this. I mean, it's kind of a, like
yeah,
it doesn't seem to be the same, peace and love kind of God that at least you hear about in the New Testament. Uh,
yeah.
but interesting, yeah.
Um, it's very interesting because as different as like Eastern and Western religions tend to be, somehow they're like these common myths with very common elements, like the story of Noah's Ark. One of the biggest stories that like almost every Hindu would know is the story of like Krishna. Krishna is a you would call an avatar, just like a particular incarnation of Vishnu on Earth. And his whole story is like he's in the city called Dwaraka, and then basically there's a bunch of like battles going on in the city, and eventually there's a when I think the way I construe it as when these people are at the point where they can no longer be pacified, or things can't go back to a stable state of being. There's a flood, and
I
it
see.
grounds the whole city of Dwarka.
See.
Yeah, it's just like there are so many strangely common elements.
Well, to
Seems like
me, like this is actually more along the lines of what I'm interested in, right? And so, I've talked to some of my philosophy friends, and one of my buddies like coined the word that like kind of my notion of religion and what I'm like thinking about here is something more like meta religion. And so it's
mm,
something like like these religious stories are up to something. Like there's something that gives rise to this, and then there is common themes among all these different religions. And it's kind of like getting at the heart of what is that, like, because it's there's patterns and modes of being. Like there just is, like if you act a
mm,
certain way, certain things will happen, and then there's certain like historical patterned trends that occur in history, and then there's certain you act in particular ways, like great things happen, and if you act in other particular ways, bad things happen, and it's trying to like extract out of that and articulate, like kind of like create a catalog in some sense and categorize. It's kind of like instead of the standard model in physics of trying to like pin down every single particle, it's trying to pin down the story of every mode of being in some sense. And it's like,
yeah.
and yeah, so like to me, I don't know. It's funny because I remember, have you heard of this thing called zeitgeist? I don't know. I remember I was talking to someone about religion, and there was this movie that came out called Zeitgeist in like 2009 or something. And this was actually my ex girlfriend, and she was I was talking to her about religion, and she was like, basically like I hate religion. Religion's terrible. And she showed me the show Zeitgeist, and like essentially their thesis was like, basically the story of Christianity, like elements of it are appearing all over the place. So, but then his claim was that invalidates Christianity, and like my idea is like, no, that's like good. That means like whatever's here, there's something actually underneath it that's giving rise to this. If independently, it's kind of like if I as a scientist come up with some result, and then someone in Germany comes up with the same result at a similar time, like it kind of sucks, especially if they publish first. But like if you if you zoom out and you think like for humanity, it's like okay, well, if they're getting the exact same result, then the likelihood that it's wrong is lower. It's like it's probably actually you're getting at something real. Um, but yeah, so to me, it's like I view it as like that's exciting that there's similar ideas and stories that are appearing in these seemingly completely independent, disconnected religions. Thanks for watching the podcast. Make sure to stay tuned for part 2 of this podcast, where we get more in depth and kind of topics like philosophy and science and religion kind of all coming together. And I think it's a pretty interesting podcast, but it's a very different theme, so I split that off into a separate video. So make sure to look out for that. This should be coming in the next few days or so. And if you made it this far and you liked the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you didn't like the podcast, give it a thumbs down. Talk to me in the comments below and let me know what your any comments or questions you might have. And if you'd like to be our next guest on the podcast, let me know. I'm still always looking for guests at this point. And until next time, take care.